Hello, Obooters from around the world. My name is Karis, and I am 13 years old, and I live in Boston, Massachusetts. Welcome to our Oboot Zoom session where me and my co-host Karis, who is 11 years old and lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Jamal, who is 16 years old and lives in Switzerland, will be interviewing our guest change maker, Professor Zoe Marks, who is currently based in the United States in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Professor Zoe Marks is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Her research and teaching interests focus on violence, race, gender, and inequality. Professor Zoe's work links to several sustainable development goals, especially goal number 10, reduced inequality. Karis, Jamal, and I will ask questions to Professor Zoe about her background, her journey, her work, her skills, and her impact. We hope that you will enjoy the session, and I will now start with our first question to our guest. Can you please tell us a little bit about you and what you do for work?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here. So let's see, a little bit about me. I'm originally from Seattle, Washington, which is on the far west coast of the United States. I now live straight across Interstate 90, which goes all the way across the US in Boston. And I have been a professor, for about 8 years now. I got my start in academia actually in the United Kingdom, where I got a master's in African Studies at the University of Oxford, followed by a doctorate in politics also at Oxford. I did my undergraduate study here in the United States. And my research, as you said, focuses on peace and conflict and gender issues, particularly in African contexts, but also a number of my projects look at kind of global trends and patterns. And so yeah, that's a little bit about me. I teach 3 classes at the Harvard Kennedy School at Harvard University. One is on Africa and global politics. One is on gender politics, which is called 21st Century Global Feminisms, which is really about how do we think about what gender equality and the struggle for gender equality will look like in this century. And then the third course that I started teaching this year is one of our core courses on race and inequality, and that's looking at race and racism in global perspective.
Have you already been to Africa, and in which countries have you been?
Oh, what a great question. Yes, I first went to the African continent when I was in university. So I went to South Africa for study abroad, and I spent 6 months at the University of Cape Town. And at the time, I thought it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I was crying when I left on the plane. I thought I would never get to go back. And then the next summer, I had an opportunity to work on a sort of research project and internship in Ethiopia. So I was working in Ethiopia for 2 months, teaching students at a local school in the Entoto region, which is right outside of the capital of Addis Ababa. I was teaching English. And then in the afternoons, I was working on a peacebuilding project with an international NGO called Mercy Corps. And then when I left Ethiopia that time, I cried again. I thought it was the last time I would ever be on the continent. And then about a year later, I found myself with a scholarship to Oxford. And that was when I started doing African studies. So from there, I've been to Sierra Leone, where I've spent the most time doing my doctoral research on civil war and peace building in that country. I've been to DRC, I've been to Uganda, I've been to Kenya, I've been to Tanzania, I've been to Ghana, and just 2 days ago I came back from Nigeria. So I don't know if I'm missing any countries, but those are the ones that come to mind at the moment that I've been to.
How did you become a professor at Harvard?
Oh, well, I was first a professor at the University of Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland in the United Kingdom. And when I was at Edinburgh, I was teaching and directing, in fact, the master's program in African Studies. So that was my first academic job. And then about 3 years ago, I was recruited to Harvard to bring some of my African Studies teaching expertise to the Harvard Kennedy School. And so I started at Harvard in 2018. But I would say that the path to get there was a little bit unpredictable in that I never expected I would be a professor. It was sort of one thing led to another. I was doing my master's degree and I wanted to finish the research project that I had started, which was the work in Sierra Leone. At the time, I was working with women who had fought in a rebel group, and I wanted to really be able to tell their story. And so I decided to do my PhD. Then from doing the PhD, I applied to a bunch of different jobs, and I got the last academic job that I applied to, which is how I ended up at Edinburgh. And then from Edinburgh, I was looking for the right opportunity to come back to the US, because I felt like it was important for me to live a bit closer to my family, and also for me to live in a country where I had voting rights and where I could contribute to the fight for racial justice.
All right. What do you like the most about Africa?
What a hard question. I mean, it's hard and it's easy. Obviously, it's the people. I love the people that I get to meet when I travel. I think there's a warmth and generosity, but also a real sense of power and purpose and resiliency and struggle that I find unmatched anywhere else in the world that I've been. I think it's hard to pick like a favorite country or favorite city or even favorite region in Africa, but I do love the people that I meet. And I think that one of the things that's really exciting about Africa with regards to its people is just how diverse it is, right? So every country has, tens, if not hundreds of different ethno-linguistic groups. There are many religions that are represented in every city and town. And then, the cultural diversity that comes with that, I think, is just unmatched anywhere else I've ever been.
So, why did you exactly choose Africa as a study, or as your, I'm searching for the word, as your point of study?
Yeah, my region of interest. It's a great question. And you know what, Jamal, a lot of my students ask me the same thing. How did I end up studying? So it was a little bit of it's kind of a long story, but basically the short version of the long story is I ended up studying Africa because of my commitment to and interest in racial justice in the United States. And so I'd been really focused on racial justice activism, or what we would call today anti-racist activism. When I was growing up, I went to public schools. They were relatively segregated. I went to university and continued that sort of activism and education work. And for me, it meant learning African American studies as well as African studies. And the more I learned about Africa, the more I wanted to repair the knowledge deficit that I had. In the United States, we don't tend to learn a lot about African history. We certainly weren't learning a lot about contemporary African politics. And then, from there, I think getting a scholarship to go to Oxford, I looked at all of the offerings at Oxford and realized that African studies was the one I was most excited about. And, moving on from that, I've become more and more invested in the power of centering Africa in conversations about global politics, but also really focusing on expanding people's access to knowledge about what's going on in Africa today, about African history, and then specifically in trying to redress global inequality, because I think the extent to which Africa has been disadvantaged in modern history is a direct result of patterns of racism that we see even in my home country of the US. And so it's a big picture, but it's also like in some ways a very small path for me, and that it was just one thing led to another. And I haven't been able to quit it. I love doing this work and connecting it to everyday realities here in the US, and also when I was in the UK to what was going on there.
How do you think climate change will impact Africa?
Well, there's a couple of ways that climate change is already impacting Africa, and it's going to continue. So the first is that it's really important for people to know that Africa has contributed very little to the problem of global warming. So we think about global warming as, how much carbon emissions have led to the insulation and overheating of the Earth's atmosphere. And because of the rate of Africa's industrialization, and that it's been much slower to industrialize than other parts of the world that have really exploited natural resources and caused the problem, African countries have done very little to create global warming. The second thing we need to know is that despite having done very little to cause the problem, most African countries are in the sort of most vulnerable position in the world. And so if you look at a map of the world that shows climate vulnerability, Africa is an incredibly vulnerable region because of things like desertification, which refers to the expansion of the Sahara Desert into what would otherwise be a buffer zone that has more trees. We see things like increasing sea levels causing problems for coastal communities and for the small island states. And then also extreme weather, unreliable access to water. All of these things, unfortunately, we're beginning to better understand are having knock-on effects with one another. So when one bad thing happens, it causes a sort of cycle, a ripple effect of other bad things. So those are the two most important things to know about Africa's climate future. But the third most important thing to know, which is much more optimistic, at least it gives us room for hope and something to be excited about, is that because African countries have been slower to industrialize, slower to build up these sort of industries and infrastructures that can sometimes be part of the problem. If everything is running on coal, it's really hard to shift to a renewable energy source. African countries are having the opportunity to use renewable energy and renewable technologies today and to chart paths to development that are more environmentally sustainable. And so we're seeing a lot of smart investments in infrastructure, a lot of investments in renewable energy compared to other sources of energy that are less sustainable, and also a lot of really exciting green innovation and green technology. And so I'm looking at what African countries are doing as sort of a blueprint for what the rest of the world should be doing.
All right. Why did you choose to teach about Africa instead of Asia?
Instead of Asia? Well, I can only say it's because it's the region I know best and like most. And so there's not really a better answer than that. I think there are lots of smart people teaching about lots of regions in the world. And it happened to be that Africa is the region that kind of interested me the most intellectually and also emotionally because of my interest in racial equality globally, and also my commitment to kind of rebalancing the knowledge and the access to information that people have about Africa. I think that there are other regions of the world that are also really deserving of attention and are maybe also misunderstood. But I have a bit more confidence that there, at the time I was studying, were more colleagues teaching on those regions. So for instance, when I joined the Kennedy School, I was able to offer the first course in quite a long time that had focused specifically on Africa. And that's the class that I'm still teaching today. And it's a really huge honor and privilege to be able to teach courses that are about the region and that give people time and space to really contextualize, conversations about everything from development and economics to conflict and peace in a framework that allows us to look at the nuances of Africa rather than just thinking about Africa as a case study for poverty or a case study for war. We can instead think about the way that African countries, for instance, created the current world system that we have of independent nation states where countries are allowed to have, their own authority over their people. That was in large part achieved through African independence movements. So I like to be able to tell those stories in a new way.
You before talked about that you fought in Ethiopia. My question would be, when people get more education or school education, the people in Africa would live better, and also they would probably find some solutions to some problems, or even would have better jobs, and that also would provide some benefits for Europe or even other continents. The problem of not having education, or not the right mass of people, but having extremely good education, is corruption. And I wanted to ask you if you have maybe a solution to that, or maybe some a start of a solution for that.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of ways to think about that question, right? One is, what do you do about corruption? The other is, what do you do about education? And then I think the third that you kind of hinted at is whether or not education always translates to jobs and improved livelihoods for people. So first, Let me focus on the education piece, which sort of stitches the other two questions together, and then we can talk more about those two things if you're interested. On education, Ethiopia and other countries have made huge strides since the Millennium Development Goals, right, which came before the SDGs, which Karis mentioned at the beginning. The Millennium Development Goals really prioritized primary education. So that's, basically kindergarten through 5th or 6th grade. And as a result of the focus on primary education, many countries in Africa made primary education free for the first time. Children were encouraged to go to school and to stop working in their small family businesses or in the farm. And we've seen a massive increase as a result of that in basic literacy and numeracy, which means that people can read and count at rates that were nothing like their parents' generation. And so I think a lot of people thought that that was good enough, right? And that's a little bit of a colonial mentality, which is that Africans needed to be educated to a basic level, but not to a higher level. And so what we're now seeing is really the need to continue providing access to educational growth opportunities and resources, like you mentioned, Jamal, where not only are children getting basic reading and math skills, but they're also getting critical thinking skills. They're getting creative skills. They're getting STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math skills. They're getting trained to be not just nurses who can go abroad, but also doctors who can invent new therapies in their home countries, right? And so, unfortunately, getting to the issue of corruption, from the 1980s through the 1990s and even up till today, many African countries have reduced investment in their universities. And the universities were seen as potential incubators or kind of hotspots for political dissent. And so unfortunately, critical thinking is not always embraced by political elites if they want to hold on to power through corrupt means, which means not just stealing money, but also, to me, it's the corruption of wanting to suppress opposition, wanting to suppress the free press, wanting to suppress the kind of radical thinking that usually emerges from universities and helps to kind of propel society forward, not just through, arts and sciences, but also through things like political science and the humanities and history and all of that. And so I think it's really important that we hold African governments accountable for their higher education systems, but it's also important that the international community, you mentioned, European countries and others outside of Africa, continues to support investment in the people, not just in things like, basic education, basic healthcare, but it's really about how do we go beyond the basics and ensure that African governments are given permission and resources to continue investing in, kind of the highest levels of education for their citizens.
Are there a lot of women who are professors at Harvard?
Are there a lot of women professors at Harvard?
Yeah.
Yes, that's a great question. I would say yes, but that's also because there are a lot of professors at Harvard. So I actually don't know, Karis, what the percentages are of women professors, but I can tell you that my generation is much more inclusive, not only of women, but also especially of women of color and men of color and people who are outside the sort of male-female category, but are part of the LGBTQ community, that the diversity of what we would call the professoriate, the people who are professors or who are teaching, is going up with younger generations. That said, the older generation or the more senior professors are the ones who have really all of the power. And they're very male dominated because we didn't even used to have equal access to education, unfortunately. So it's taking a while for it to get closer to gender equality. And I would say we still have a ways to go.
Okay, so what do you think of the fact that Africans can't easily go to Europe and they have to risk their lives like crossing the sea to make it to Europe?
Well, I think it's terrible. Personally, I think that there are lots of good reasons why people need to move. And I think that if we continue to have a deeply unequal global economy, people will continue to need to move for economic survival, for medical survival, and for the basic well-being, not only of their own kind of selves and aspirations, but also of their families. And so there's, I think, some reasons why countries want to manage migration flows. They want to manage information, they want to manage resources. And yet the kind of police state, what we call, to use like the big terms of political science, we call it securitization, which is like turning the movement of people into something that looks like a crime or a war problem. This is like the security problem, is totally the wrong way to think about it. We need to be thinking about people as not only human beings who have human rights that are inalienable and are protected by international law, but we also need to think about people as resources, as opportunities, as sites of innovation, of love, of creativity, of entrepreneurship, and to treat people in that way. And so I would like to see a lot more new ideas taking center stage rather than the sort of fear and xenophobia or anti-migrant policies. I personally lived as an immigrant in the United Kingdom and in France and in West Africa throughout my adult life, from age 20 to, I'm giving away my age now, but like 33. And, you know, it was difficult being an immigrant, and I was one with a lot of power and privilege because I was there on a student visa and then on a work visa. But while I was in the UK, they shifted to a policy that was designed to make the UK unwelcoming to migrants like me, and specifically to migrants who are from poorer backgrounds. And so I think we need to totally overhaul the system.
Borderlines of a lot of countries were brought during the colonization. What do you think about them, and do you think we should redraw them around people in general, because some folks have been divided in two and a lot of wars have happened because of that? And do you think we should redraw them?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question, and it's a very controversial one. It's actually one that I asked my class at Harvard. So in short, I think that it needs to be up to African people and their leaders what happens with colonial boundaries, right? So Africa's existing borders look more or less like the colonial divisions that were created in the late 1800s, right? So it was the very late 1800s, which means that even these boundaries are only about 150 years old at the most. And then independence happened for the most part around 1960 onwards. And so that means as independent states, these countries are only about 60 years old at the most. And so there is this sort of idea that these are relatively new boundaries. Maybe they're not the best they could be. Maybe we should redraw them. But African people have largely become very invested in the countries that exist today. And so I think that it's basically politically impossible to do a major overhaul. But what we have seen African leaders come up with is instead trying to increase free movement of people and goods between countries, which is a way to kind of, much like what the European Union has done, protect the national identities and ideas of borders that people have between populations and the land, but also integrate the economies, the cultures, the kind of labor markets so that people can easily work not just between Belgium and France, but between Nigeria and Ghana, or Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. And so I think that it's called the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is a really long name and a big acronym, but that is the sort of solution that the African Union is moving towards as a way to overcome the problem of borders while also respecting the national identities of people who've grown up in these countries their whole lives.
What's the toughest thing that you've done in your job?
The toughest thing I've done in my job? Well, I mean, it's kind of a silly answer, but it would have to be writing my PhD. So you have to write at Oxford, it's 100,000 words, which was, yeah, it's more than 300 pages. And you start it with like this outline and this idea. And then I went and did research in Sierra Leone, which I loved, involved talking to hundreds of people who I never would have met otherwise. But people were telling me their stories about living through civil war, about surviving all kinds of tragedies and traumas. And so it was almost overwhelming to try to turn that into something that was an academic kind of output, and to do it in a way that made, sort of a broader contribution to knowledge. And so I think for a couple of years there, it just didn't look like it was ever going to become a thesis. And then one day I put all the chapter files together and I created a table of contents, and I almost burst into tears because I finally could see the light at the end of the tunnel. So I would say that's actually the hardest thing, is trying to move from relationships and stories into the sort of packaging of what academic research is. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed since finishing my PhD is teaching and writing for public audiences and trying to do more of the things that keep the stories alive, rather than just turning them into research that no one reads. I still turn them into research, but I also want to make sure that policymakers learn about it, that students learn about it, that members of the public can learn about it.
What is your favorite African soccer team?
My favorite African soccer team? I don't think I can answer that question because I have to teach students from all over the continent. That's like asking me who makes the best jollof rice. I will politely decline the question. What's your favorite African soccer team, Karis?
I don't know. I mean, if it was international teams, I'd have to say Tunisia, because I'm from Tunisia.
There you go.
Right. I have another question for you, because you declined that question. Who inspires you?
Who inspires me?
And why?
Lots of people. I'll give you 3 answers. The first person who comes to mind is my mother. She was also a teacher. She's now retired, but I think that she's really inspiring because she's just never lived a day in her life where she wasn't curious about everything and learning something, and incredibly enthusiastic. And so it was really a privilege to be raised by someone who was so curious and enthusiastic about the world. And I think it probably explains why I've never really stopped studying. The second person who inspires me is my students. They have just done so much with their lives already, and they're so focused on contributing positively to the world. And it's really exciting to be able to be part of their journey and to watch them kind of unpack how they think about things and then put it back together and graduate with a degree that recognizes that achievement, but also helps to kind of launch them into the next phase of their lives where they're going to make even bigger impact. And then the third set of people that really inspire me are people from the communities I get to work with who have survived incredibly heartbreaking and terrible conflict events, and yet are just some of the most empowered and optimistic and forgiving people I've ever met. So coming recently from Northeast Nigeria, I'm thinking about my colleagues who I was working with in Maiduguri, the community members and people who lived through the war who told us their stories. They continue to inspire me and make me committed to continue the work I do.
Another question I would have would be, at the time, again, back to corruption, a lot of politicians sell minerals or just mining grounds for them for a lot of money, but actually for the worth of the ground or for the material, it's quite less few money. What we expected to the market happen, or in general to European supplies or to Asian or American supplies, if Africa would sell the minerals to the real price, or what exactly would just happen, and what would be the consequence of it?
Are you talking about natural mineral resources?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
This is a really important topic, especially as we transition to more of a green economy. We've got rechargeable batteries in our cars. A lot of the things that we not only rely on, but are expecting to use more and more in the future, like electric cars, like smartphones, computers, they rely heavily on what are called rare earth minerals, which I think is part of what you're talking about, right? Like cobalt, coltan, titanium, all of these things. And some of the richest deposits are in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there are also deposits elsewhere. So China has recently basically consolidated a monopoly, which means that one company controls all of its own resources. They used to control 15 out of 19 cobalt mines in DRC. And there's currently an investigation underway to find out whether they've been avoiding paying the correct amount of taxes, right? And so this is all very political, because whoever can control access to these rare resources in some ways controls the opportunities to reshape technology of the future. I think it is important that countries like Congo and other countries that have some high value mineral resources negotiate in a competitive marketplace so that they can get the best deals for their people. And I think it's one of the few places where actually marketplace competition can generate what's basically a fair price and a true price. But what often happens is the governments negotiate what are called concessionary contracts, which means that one company gets to control the mine, and that kind of locks them into pricing that's not always as high as it would be on an open market, but more importantly, that can lead to this thing like siphoning off of resources instead of paying the correct value on taxes to take them out of the country.
Thank you, Obooties, for listening to this interview. Thank you, Professor Zoe, Karis, and Jamal, for the great discussion, for everything that we learned today. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can hear about upcoming sessions with other change makers. Please also tell your friends about Oboot and share social media links with them. And last but not least, go to oboot.co to learn about opportunities to collect digital badges and help us plant trees.